French President Hollande in China to talk about climate change. With me in the studio on that issue, we have Professor Qi Ye from the School of Public Policy and Management from Tsinghua University. Welcome, Professor Qi. It's great to have you in our studio. And meanwhile, in London, we have Isabel Hilton, CEO and editor of ChinaDialogue.net. And she has been dealing with environmental climate change issues for decades. Thank you very much for being with us. And meanwhile, in Paris, we are having Dr. Olivier Guillard, Asia Research Director at the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs, or IRIS. Welcome to the three of you. Professor Qi, first of all, how significant when China and France see eye to eye on some of the important issues related to climate change talks later this year, will the overall picture be changed?
Well, France is, especially at Paris, the host of the next COP21. And as we were moving, there are only a few weeks into this major conference on climate change. And China is a major emitter of greenhouse gases. At the same time, China is a major contributor to the success of the Paris meeting. And as we have heard from China's the intended nationally determined contribution to addressing climate change, and also for the President Xi Jinping's presidential statement with Obama, and we see China is going to be a major contributor to this conference. So when the two presidents, the two countries get together, this is bound to be very, very important for the world. Right?
Besides diplomatic talks, let me ask you, Mr. Guillard, what do you consider could be some of the most important issues that the two countries can still work on before the conference begins?
What we can say is that even that half a century after the beginning of the bilateral diplomatic relations between Beijing and Paris, remains probably to be dealt with, to be built a stronger partnership or mutual understanding between the two countries. In France, for instance, in Paris specifically, we see mainly China by two angles. The one is the most glamorous, if I may say, angle of this bilateral relationship, with China being the second largest economy in the world, with a pretty significant and extraordinary GDP growth rate for decades.
Right.
So this is the point number one. The point number two is that we need to create a better understanding of what exactly will be the place of this bilateral strategic partnership in the future, and to explain that to the public opinion.
Yeah, but I want to ask you specifically more about climate change, because after all, Mr. Hollande's mission in China is more about that than specifically only about trade. So on that point, can you be a little bit more specific? What can the two countries do to make the conference a better success, shall we say, at least, than the previous ones?
Exactly. There is a bilateral, quite similar attempt or expectations about this conference. Both, specifically from the French government and the Chinese government, they do expect this conference to be a success. But to be a success, you need to create the atmosphere, at least with most of the main actors being on the same line. It is what have been successfully so far doing President Xi Jinping and French President Hollande. That means to say, we do not speak exactly the same language, but at least we're on the same page, on the same world, on the same planet, with the same global warming coming and with the same expectations for the next generation. So at least they've been quite good to work successfully so far on this issue.
Of course, for you, who is a geopolitics political expert, maybe that's the steps you would go to. But for you, Ms. Hilton, I understand it could be more specific. For example, let me just throw you this specific question. The two sides have been talking about an ambition about creating a relatively legal binding mechanism, a relatively important mechanism to monitor, which previously have agreed by all parties, not necessarily going to be an international agreement to follow everybody's responsibility. So can you be more specific on that? How can we achieve the two goals at the same time, Ms. Hilton?
Yes, it is a very important question, and there's a certain amount of fudging around what legally binding really means. What it doesn't mean and what it won't mean is a kind of top-down treaty in which countries have to answer, as it were, to an external legal authority or be punished or sanctioned or suffer some international difficulty if they fail to do what they've promised. And that was rather the structure at Copenhagen, which, if you remember, ended very badly, COP15. So what was learned after that, I think, was that this process was more likely to be successful if people started from the bottom up, if they brought to the table that which they knew they could do, and they were encouraged to promise more by competition, if you like, by the fact that these promises were public. And that we really, when we say legally binding, I mean, I think as much as it means anything, it means that countries are expected to monitor their own promises and to implement the kind of legislation that would ensure the delivery of their promises. So a climate change act or laws on renewables, a structure that actually guarantees delivery. But what it won't be is a top-down process. Now, the problem with that is, how do you follow up, how do you monitor, how do you revisit the targets?
On the basis of equality and also the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and also respective capabilities, these are the key words that the two presidents, Chinese and the French, have been focusing on this time during their talk. A lot of adjectives over there.
That's right.
But Professor Chi, will this is more making the agreement, possible agreement at the climate change conference, more realistic than it used to be?
Well, it is realistic because right now the future, I mean, this expected agreement is going to be based on the INDCs, the intended nationally determined contributions.
Meaning every country committed to what they want to commit.
Yes.
Yes.
So that makes it realistic.
But then the question is, if I could just follow up.
Then the question is, this commitment, whether or not it is enough, ambitious enough. A week ago in Bonn, when the negotiators get together, they have some third-party reviews, and then they realize, for instance, for the United States, when you compare their INDC and the responsibilities 1/5, and the Europeans, right, the EU as a whole 1/3. So overall, basically we need another Paris Agreement, to reach the 2 degrees. So that's the one thing. Perhaps we're not going to have enough at this stage, but in the future, probably we have to come back to revisit and to increase the level of ambitious.
Let me just be very specific and very direct here. The two presidents already talk about 5 years. 5 years of reviewing the current commitments made by countries for this specific agreement. It's about countries, they commit, but whether they're going to implement it is another thing.
That's right.
They just cannot do that. It's just say, well, I'm going to do this, and then they throw the papers away. 5 years later, nothing has been done, or not much has been done. So this is what the two presidents are talking about.
That's right.
But the question is, Professor Chi, the differences between quote-unquote legally binding and a monitoring system to come back in 5 years to look at what countries have achieved compared to what they have committed.
Right.
How do you differentiate these two concepts?
Well,
if the previous one was not successful, as Ms. Hilton mentioned earlier, will the latter one be one that's successful?
Well, this legally binding, the meaning of legally binding has been evolving over time.
Right.
And now we're talking about legally binding. It's more of legally binding within individual countries. And this worked for some countries. For instance, China, right? Right now, China is making the 5-year plan, and we know the specific measures are going to be implemented. We know exactly what kind of the steps to take to monitor the success. We know exactly what to be expected at the end of the 5 years. However, it's not every country can do this. Different countries operate on different procedures and their own
Political environment as well.
Exactly, political environment, their own paces.
Right.
So right now, I think it's a real big challenge for the UNFCCC is to come up, a standard procedure that everyone agrees, what to expect in terms of monitoring, verification, and also at the sanction. The bottom line is, and it is really, really hard, if possible at all, to make the sanction happen if someone is going to break the agreement.
Right. Mr. Guillard, we know from the very beginning that Paris has been very, very ambitious about this climate change conference. And it does want to make a difference compared to the previous ones. For example, in Copenhagen, which all agree has been quite a failure and dissatisfaction, in fact, about the result. But will it be able to achieve? I want to have your expertise. What needs to be equipped now with the preparation of the Paris conference so that it can be a success, including some of the elements the other two guests have mentioned earlier?
What I can tell you is that I've got quite good friends working in the French government, some experts, some are private experts as well, that have been working for months, if not for already 1 year, on a permanent basis to make this conference a success. So they have been doing a quite impressive work. And if I may say, they have once again one fear, is that despite all this energy, despite all the commitment, despite all this positive momentum on this conference and the very important goals that have to be achieved in the short-term future or for the next generation, they are still said between, we have a fear that despite all this, we will have all the main actors around the table with a significant engagement and commitment to this issue, but still, how will we be able to be sure that between the commitment and what is delivered by the end of the day, the gap or the difference or the ratio will not be too large. And this is not a matter of motivation, not a matter of a concern. It's about how to make sure simply that people will remember tomorrow what they said a couple of days ago. And it's a complicated story.
It is very different, let me tell you. After reporting on some of the climate change conferences, Ms. Hilton, I met many times you over there in those conferences. Here's the thing. How much would they mean for the European countries? I mean, now with Paris hosting this conference on climate change, to, in a way, erase the memories people have about Copenhagen, which has been quite a failure. How much do you think that this specific conference hosted by Paris will be able to provide at least some momentum for us to establish certain degrees of confidence?
The thing is that
Ms.
if we
Hilton.
just, I would just...
Yeah, Ms. Hilton, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I think it's pretty critical. France is, has a very experienced diplomatic corps, and this has been France's diplomatic priority certainly all year, and I think probably for longer than that. France has a lot riding on this in terms of prestige, but actually the whole of Europe, you might say the whole world, has a lot riding on this. If this doesn't work, then we really are collectively, all of us, in pretty deep trouble. Now, having said that, there's a lot of expectation management going on here. Copenhagen was presented as all or nothing, and when it failed, there was a lot of pessimism and depression, which took a lot of getting over. There's a certain amount of expectation management going on vis-a-vis Paris. If you think back 2 years ago, the ambition was to get a deal with all the INDCs adding up to a pathway that kept us below a global temperature rise of 2 degrees. We're not going to get there in Paris. What matters then is to have a ratchet mechanism whereby we revisit the ambition and we tighten the ambition on a regular basis. Now, the expectation management part is that if you look at what Christiana Figueres was saying last week and look at the bending of the curve that has already taken place, in which China has played a big part, so that emissions that were just going up are, bending. And so we are kind of on the right track. We just need to bend that curve much more fiercely, if you like, much more rapidly. And the basis for that is a common accord in Paris. It's a way station on the journey. It's not the end of the journey.
We put a lot of hope on the common accord, as Ms. Hilton mentioned, but there has always been those traditional conflicts, developing versus developed economies, emerging economies also involved with China,
Yes.
which category, in developing or emerging. And
right.
meanwhile, there will be those
Yes.
that are legally binding within the countries, and yet political change, as we mentioned earlier,
Yes.
things years later, everything changed.
Right.
So Professor Chi, this is about France prestige, because it's been working so hard on this. And this is also about whether China and France can work together on this such a significant project. It is also about whether the world really could wake up and do something about for ourselves.
Right.
What do you think can be the prospect if, as indicated already, the French and the Chinese president, at least for now, are already holding hands on this?
Well, it is a prestige, it's also responsibility and the leadership to take. And for the my prospect, the way I look at this, I think we're going to have an agreement. I do not have I have very little doubt about that. But I do want to alert is this agreement is going to be viewed by many people, in the world outside that conference. I think it is as important as we see within the conference hall, what the negotiator is going to do, and also outside,
Right.
what the people in the world, the NGOs, all the organizations to see, because now we see more agreement within the countries right now, very different than Copenhagen, but we see an increasing gap between the expectation of the negotiators and expectation of the people in the world.
Right.
Right.
It is a very sad phenomenon, shall I say, put it that way. But let me go to you, Mr. Guillard, before we wrap up. What role does France have in mind in its aspiration to hold its position in Europe and also in the world on the climate change issue? How much hope do you pin on there for the China-French cooperation in this regard?
The French government has been quite clear. The French media as well, by the way, all the experts community as well, to understand the global view that if we are not able between two major countries like China and France, if we are not able between the French, the German, the British, and all the 25 different other European governments to get an idea of what we want for our future, for our children in 1, 2, or 3 generations from here, what is the interest of working that hard? So there are huge expectations, huge responsibility, and I would say that it's not about, it was said a couple of days ago in the French media that it was a matter of not only prestige, but a matter of political leadership for the French government, for the French president, less than 2 years before the next presidential elections, to make this conference a success and to work as hard as possible to negotiate and to deal with the potential difference between the different governments. So it's not about, it's about tomorrow. It's not about today, it's about tomorrow. And what is tomorrow is easier to sell to the goals for the generations than to the people that are looking for immediate results.
Right.
It will be a complicated and probably more complicated issues that we expect for next month.
Very interesting. We're looking forward to that, particularly when Chinese and the French presidents are already talking about some of the mechanisms need to be established over there. Thank you so much, Dr. Olivier Guillard in France for us in Paris.
Merci.
Isabel Hilton in London for us from ChinaDialogue.net, and Professor Chi with us in Beijing from Tsinghua University. Thank you so much, the three of you.